August 12th, 2013, Big Sean, Jay Electronica, and Kendrick Lamar debut Control. This single record would send shockwaves throughout hip-hop, which we wouldn't see the culmination of until over a decade later. During his verse, Kendrick Lamar called out his contemporaries, urging them to step up their game or be left behind. After all, hip-hop since its inception had been competitive, and Kendrick wanted competition. Every rapper Kendrick named in his verse would acknowledge that he didn't mean any disrespect. No one had a problem with it, other than Drake. This perceived slight would begin a decades-long feud between Kendrick Lamar and Drake, who traded subliminal shots at one another on track after track throughout the 2010s. But it all came to a head March 26, 2024, with Kendrick Lamar's verse on Metro Boomin' and Future's Like That. This direct diss forced Drake to respond, and one of the biggest events in hip-hop history would begin. I've been entrenched in both Lorcana and the Kendrick-Drake beef for the past several months, which is maybe why I draw this connection. But I couldn't help but think of the contempt these two rappers have for each other and Drake's fall from grace when I began writing this video about Bucky. How did a fan favorite become the most despised figure by the community at large? This is a video about love and hate.
Oh gosh, the deck that everybody hates to hate or loves to love, Emerald Steel. It's my least favorite matchup.
Emerald Steel is going to be it's going to infest my local scene.
Oh, cool. A new set 4 tournament. I bet there's a really diverse meta with lots of different decks in the top 8. Let's see here. Okay, we've got Emerald Steel, 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 and Emerald Steel. What?
I think Bucky's the problem. If we take away the thing that gives all the Floodborns essentially an ETB ability, Diablo is of the power level that I would expect.
It gets there slowly, but instead of getting there by just blitzing it with lore, it blitzes your opponent's hand out to oblivion.
We've gone from the most diverse meta of all time in set 4, and suddenly there's a tournament where the whole top 8 is Emerald Steel.
I will 100% wholeheartedly agree. Bucky, go.
So Ruby Amethyst, $200.
Reasonable.
Ruby Sapphire, $400. Green Steel, $800.
Yeah.
Once we started getting these 3-cost Floodborns, Bucky became insane. Bucky is going to be one of the first cards banned. You can book it.
That's what you get for being a potato and playing a discard deck. You deserve to be poor. No, I'm kidding.
But yeah, I mean, $800.
So why do you hate Emerald Steel so much?
I just hate it with a passion. It's just because I like to play my cards. This deck leans heavily into a kind of a sub game of discard. They try to put you in top deck mode, kind of by turn 4 or 5 as kind of the goal of the Bucky line of play. And I like to play my cards.
Thursday, October 5th, 2023. Bucky, Squirrel Squeak Tutor, is revealed to Lorcana fans around the world. A 2-cost 1/1 with Ward who quests for 1 and requires Floodborn characters to be viable didn't make the huge splash that you would think, considering the utter distaste the player base would have for the Squirrel just 8 months later. Many would point out that the majority of Floodborn characters released at that time were over 5 ink. Bucky would essentially sit there doing nothing for the majority of the game as your opponent took advantage of the wasted turn you spent playing a character who does nothing. But some players saw something sinister coming. The boogeyman was simply sitting in the shadows, lying in wait for the opportune moment to manifest, to upend the Lorcana metagame, for better or for worse. Just 2 months later, on Sunday, January 21st, Bucky would win its first notable event in France. The deck was piloted by Thomas K. and was the skeleton upon which Bucky's final form would eventually be built. An Emerald Steel list featuring the dreaded Squirrel, Prince John for card draw, and 20 Floodborn characters to fuel the discard package, as well as a host of control spells to keep the opponent's deck in check. Bucky steamrolled to a first-place finish, only dropping one single match the entire tournament. 1 month later, Bucky would make top cut yet again at PPG TCG Con Houston in the hands of Robert Green. While Bucky would continue to see some success within Emerald Steel decks, by the time the Into the Inklands set had settled, he was being completely cut from the deck. With the emergence of powerful decks like Ruby Sapphire Control, Amber Steel Songs, and Ruby Amethyst, Bucky was considered too weak to compete, even in what was being lauded as the most diverse metagame in the short history of Lorcana.
Good morning, Lorcana fans. We're here in Atlanta, Georgia for the first ever Dizzy Lorcana Challenge. I'm Tannen Grayson, I'll be your host all weekend long. We've got a great crew with us here this weekend, so we'll be bringing you all the action all day long. Now, we have 2 days of competition here. First day, we've got just under 2,000 players that are going to be playing best of 2, and the top 64 of those are going to make it onto day 2, and then maybe into the top 8, we're going to be trying to take home one of those gold serialized Mickeys. So without further ado, I'm going to sit in on deck.
Out of the 13 Emerald Steel decks to make top 64 in the first US Lorcana Challenge in Atlanta, only one of them featured the diminutive Squirrel. With Alexandru Tabirna at the helm, the deck made it all the way to the top 8 of the largest Lorcana tournament to date before eventually falling to Albert Garcia's Ruby Amethyst list. While Bucky fell short of the grand prize, the boogeyman had shown its face, and with the release of Ursula's return, he would emerge as the true villain of the format, and his reign of terror would truly begin. The rodent who had been waiting in the back of players' minds finally reared his head. Much like Kendrick Lamar's innocuous control verse simmered for years, being bolstered by subliminal shots before breaking out in an explosion of hate-filled diss tracks during the spring and into the summer of 2024, Bucky was about to emerge and show players why he should have always been feared. Bucky finally received the support he needed to terrorize the meta with 3 simple cards. Aladdin, that turn 3 Floodborn that players who saw Bucky's potential back when Rise of the Floodborn was released were worried about. Not only was he a 3-cost Floodborn, but he also had a very relevant ability, allowing him to crash into the opponent's precious items and banishing them whenever questing. With Ruby Sapphire establishing itself as an early Tier 1 deck for Ursula's return, Emerald Steel simultaneously gained a powerful answer that benefited their primary win condition of discard. Diablo, Maleficent Spy, a card that would be fairly harmless on its own, now became an integral part of the deck, allowing the player to spy on their opponent's hand and take note of any upcoming threats, while also manifesting fear in their opponents because they knew what was coming next.
My pet, you are my last hope. Circle far and wide. Search for a maid of 16 with hair of sunshine gold and lips red as the rose. Go, and do not fail me.
Diablo, Devoted Herald. When shifted onto Maleficent Spy, Diablo becomes one of the scariest turn 2 threats because he requires no ink to play. By discarding an action, Diablo can come in without paying any ink, which allows the Emerald Steel player to preemptively play Bucky. Then by shifting Diablo on the same turn, you force your opponent to pay the same price you did to play the Devoted Herald, discarding a card. After this, Diablo can immediately sing Let the Storm Rage On, eliminating your opponent's early board presence, then drawing a card. After passing your turn, Devoted Herald draws you another card, and if it is left unanswered, Diablo will draw twice the amount of cards as your opponent, while Bucky thrashes their hand until they have nowhere to hide. The villain was no longer alone. What makes this line of play so powerful is the mulligan in Lorcana. In this game, you can send back as many or as few cards as you'd like and draw back that same number with no penalty, but you can only do this once. Because the mulligan is so powerful, it is easy for the Bucky player to keep the parts of their combo while sending back anything that doesn't fit, making the deck extremely consistent. Diablo is now considered one of the most powerful cards in the game, with every single deck in the format teching in multiple answers. When he was revealed, there were mixed feelings. Some considered the card to be too clunky, too slow, or too easily answered, while others knew he and Bucky would terrorize every tournament from your local game store's weekly league to the most prestigious events, the Lorcana Challenges. And terrorize they did. By the time of Set 4's big box release, Frank Karsten, Magic the Gathering Hall of Famer and first ever Lorcana champion, called Diablo one of the cards that he would want to open most in the limited format, and he would later dub Bucky the boogeyman of Lorcana. On the 31st of May at the UK Games Expo, Bucky would take first place in 2 of the 3 tournaments held there, and just a couple days later, during the PAX 10K, Bucky would take first yet again. But things really wouldn't get out of hand until the next week at the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Chicago.
Welcome, Illumineers. It is with my deepest pride and greatest pleasure to welcome you to the Disney Lorcana Challenge here in Chicago, Illinois.
Brian Cortade piloted his version of Emerald Steel, which differed from previous iterations, choosing to drop Pegasus and his Floodborn version, as well as Tinkerbell, instead opting for Ursula Deceiver of All and Flynn Rider to give him a tremendous late-game threat that evaded removal like Baboom and Grab Your Swords. This would prove to be a winning strategy, as he dropped Flynn onto the board against Ruby Amethyst player Kurt Spiess in the semi-finals. Along with Bucky and Robin Hood, Flynn put enough pressure on Kurt to take the first game. In their second game, Brian was able to draw the perfect hand of Diablo, Maleficent Spy on turn 1, Bucky on turn 2, along with Shift Diablo, Devoted Herald, to force a discard. With no brawl in hand to banish Diablo, Kurt sat watching the legendary bird draw turn after turn after turn. With no answer to Bucky, Kurt was forced to discard cards turn after turn after turn. And despite missing multiple draw triggers on Diablo during their final game, despite having all his characters banished with a Be Prepared on turn 7, it just didn't matter. There was no answer for Diablo on turn 2, and with too few cards in hand for Kurt and too many in hand for Brian, the game was sealed, putting Bucky into the finals of the second ever US Lorcana Challenge. In the final match, Brian and Bucky faced Jordan Moore, piloting his Emerald Amethyst list. This game started like the last game: turn 1 Diablo Maleficent Spy, turn 2 Bucky, Shift Diablo Devoted Herald. Despite Jordan's turn 2 Ursula Deceiver, Brian was still able to shift in Diablo and sing Let the Storm Rage On to clear the Cursed Merfolk. With the most powerful opening hand for the deck, Brian went on to win the first game in under 10 minutes. In Game 2, Jordan rallied with the early questing power of Cursed Merfolk, a solid mid-game with Merlin Goats, and then finishing off with Flynn Rider and Pegasus. In the final game of the tournament, Brian was on the play, but didn't hit his Diablo turn 1 target. He was forced instead to play Robin Hood, but still followed up the beloved outlaw with the Squirrel himself. But without his turn 2 Diablo, Brian was forced to play a bit differently, and the two finalists would trade threats and burn removal while they battled for board presence. However, on turn 5, Brian played the most expensive card in the game, who, like Diablo, allows him to draw twice as many cards as his opponent. Beast Tragic Hero is easily the best card in the deck outside of the two All-Stars. Being a Floodborn, he forces a discard out of the opponent when Bucky is on the field, and each turn he has no damage, he draws an extra card. With this new draw engine online, Jordan was forced to turn it off, banishing the beast with Ursula, and Merlin gave Jordan a little breathing room until Brian was able to drop 2 Diablos and another beast, allowing Brian to draw 4 cards to his opponent's 1, effectively putting Jordan's deck into a stranglehold and taking the third ever Lorcana Challenge with 2 Buckies and 2 Diablos on board. Following this dominant victory, the player base experienced more fear and loathing for the Squirrel than ever before. Becoming the most popular deck around the globe overnight, the innocent-looking 1-1 for 2 seemed inescapable. Calls for bans were rampant across the community, with many players citing that they want to play Lorcana, not watch their opponent play out the optimal curve every game, successfully locking them out, while the Bucky player enjoyed a nice relaxing game of solitaire. This feeling of dread would carry on into Bochum, the second Disney Lorcana challenge of the Bucky era, where 39% of the top 64 players earned their place, terrorizing their opponents with the true villain of Lorcana.
And for the first time for this day of DLC Bochum, we see the Squirrel Squeak Tutor hit the floor. 2-cost Inkable 1-1, quest for 1, the ward keyword, meaning it can't be chosen, and whenever you play a Floodhorn, you make your opponent discard a card, and there is that play that I was just talking about.
But only one single Emerald Steel deck would make the top 4, and that deck was beaten by Ruby Amethyst, a color combination that would go on to win the entire challenge.
He needs a go. It's not a go, it's a brawl! And Theatime Bishow is going to be your Bochum Disney Lorcana Challenge champion!
What a game! It came down to the Battle of the Goats.
After dropping jab after jab, track after track, Drake was baiting Kendrick, insisting that Kendrick come out. Don't hide. It's time to, as you said, prove that you're a problem. Then Kendrick dropped Euphoria, a 6-minute dissection of Drake filled with double, triple, and quadruple entendres, with some references so personal that only Drake could ever understand. Halfway through the track, Kendrick defines what their beef is about. This truly was a battle fueled by hate. With no love lost between the two MCs, things were getting personal, and with no end in sight, we patiently waited to see what Drake would do. Ruby Amethyst showed up in force, and it felt like it was the only one who could challenge Emerald Steel, and challenge it did. Ruby Amethyst would prove itself to be a worthy contender in Bochum, but everywhere else, the monstrous rodent would terrify players. Towards the tail end of every set, Lorcana sponsors a special event for all of their players across the world. Local game shops far and wide are sent exclusive enchanted cards and limited edition playmats that their players can compete for and win. Meant to be a celebration of the set and local Lorcana leagues, set championships are a chance for players everywhere to test their mettle in a more competitive tournament to win these fabulous prizes. The enchanted cards and exclusive playmats up for grabs are worth hundreds of dollars on the secondary market, and many players attend multiple set championships for their chance to earn as many as possible. And because the prizing provided by Ravensburger is so strong, the competition is stiff. The players are serious, which means they want to bring the most powerful deck that they can for a chance to take home these coveted prizes. That meant that the Squirrel would be an ever-present force, not just at the highest level, but even in the smallest of game shops. In my first week of set championships, I expected a more budget-friendly approach from local players. Considering Emerald Steel was a deck pushing 4 figures, I thought most players would opt for the other prominent decks in the format, Amethyst Ruby, Sapphire Steel, and Ruby Sapphire, with some fun homebrews mixed in. Packing my own Ruby Amethyst deck, teched for the mirror matchup, I had to battle an Emerald Steel in the top 8 to earn my first Ursula. After coming out on top, I was just one match from a guaranteed playmat, but the loathsome Emerald Steel list would appear again, knocking me out 2 games to none and sending me home. The next day, I changed my deck a bit. No longer worried about the mirror, I wanted to be prepared for that diabolic bird and the endlessly aggravating squirrel. In my second set championships of the week, I played against Emerald Steel in round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4, and round 5 of Swiss. I barely squeaked into the top 8, going 3-2 in some of the most draining matches I've ever endured in any TCG. One mistake would be met with certain defeat, assuming I even had the chance and my opponent didn't draw the perfect opener, which happened more than once throughout the day. By top 8, I was burnt out. I couldn't bear the sight of Bucky hitting the board again. I hated that squirrel. Most of the players I talked to did, even the ones playing the card. They hated themselves for playing it, for invoking Bucky's name. Many were ashamed or embarrassed when they played their first turn, acknowledging that it was a miserable experience for their opponent and even for themselves. The following week, I considered switching to Emerald Steel as well. It was such a brutal matchup. I wanted to seek a brief respite, even if it meant turning to the perceived dark side. This sentiment was echoed throughout the community. Stores were flooded with Emerald Steel players hoping to score an Enchanted Ursula and a playmat for themselves. As we all prepared for another week of championships, getting ourselves ready to face squirrel after squirrel after squirrel after squirrel, we were saved. Well, almost.
It actually happened. Bucky is dead.
The squirrel has been changed. The squirrel has been nerfed.
Firstly, Bucky is becoming a free cost.
Keyword ward, no longer a thing.
But that's not it. It's also changing its ability where now, whenever you play a Floodborn character, if you used Shift to play them, each opponent chooses and discards a card.
No longer will you be able to do turn 1 Diablo, turn 2 Bucky, Shift Diablo to make your opponent discard a card.
Is this card going to see any competitive play moving forwards?
Oh, without the war, dude, Bucky is free reign. Fire the cannons!
I don't want to say this kills Bucky, but this puts Bucky in a very, very different deck.
I think any of those 3 changes on its own would have been a lot to deal with already, but all of those 3 together, I don't think we're going to see it anymore.
While Bucky was all but banned, this change wouldn't go into effect until the release of Shimmering Skies a month later, which meant players far and wide were forced to play matches against a deck acknowledged by Ravensburger themselves to be an unenjoyable experience, all while trying to maintain their sanity and composure to try and win an Ursula Sea Witch Queen. But this delay also meant that the squirrel would have one last hurrah in Fort Worth, Texas.
Good morning, Illumineers, and welcome to Fort Worth, Texas. We're here for the Disney Lorcana Challenge. We've got a star-studded field here. We've got former champions, tons of people that have been in some top 8 stuff, so I expect some great Lorcana here all weekend long. And without further ado, let's get to the action.
The final Disney Lorcana Challenge with the pre-errata Bucky. Players all over North America flocked to Fort Worth, Texas to fling some cardboard and attempt to write their names in the Lorcana history books. With fantastic prizes and the opportunity to attend Worlds on the line, many players would turn to the squirrel. After the dust had settled on the first day, nearly 50% of the top 64 deck lists contained the Bucky Diablo combo, cementing itself as the premier deck in the Swiss rounds. Not even the deck's greatest rival, Ruby Amethyst, was able to reach a double-digit player count in the top 64. But as the top cut played out, more and more Emerald Steel decks were being knocked out, one by one, until every single squirrel was eliminated from the competition, leaving Ruby Amethyst and Amber Steel Songs as the final 2.
Does find the namesake Diablo of this tournament. A good send-off to Emerald Steel here. We have Diablo and Jafar hitting the field, and we're going to draw 2 cards off this Queen's Castle. And
up to 17, 18, 19 lore. Does he have a goat or a way to bounce a goat? The game would be over, and it looks like we do. Second goat.
Another goat.
Just as in Bochum, Emerald Steel players would have to sit and watch as Ruby Amethyst went back to back. While Emerald Steel tried to fight back after Ruby Amethyst's dominant win in Bochum, not even the massive advantage of having 47% of top cut wielding the squirrel could stop Ruby Amethyst. Again, this entire story played out just like the legendary moment in hip-hop just a few months prior. Drake would come back strong with Family Matters, but Kendrick went back-to-back as he said he would. He drowned out the noise and gave the people an anthem for the summer.
We're going to Gate 2 to take us from 17, 18, 19, and he has the Merlin Goat to go on to the top 16.
So Churn and Boggs remains on the board, and that means if a goat is found by Fear Time, it will be a victory. There it is!
Right off the top, Joe.
And there's the handshake. Ruben is going to the final.
Oh, what an incredible game.
Oh, look at that. We've got our final set here, Joe. And we got Fear Time with Amethyst Ruby against Ruben with Amethyst Ruby. He needs a go. It's not a go, it's a brawl. And Fear Time Show is going to be your Bochum Disney Lorcana Challenge champion.
And your champion of the Dallas-Fort Worth Lorcana Challenge, Edmund Chu! Let's hear it one more time for your entire top 8 here. They played amazing all weekend long.
Kendrick hates Drake, but loves hip-hop. We hated Bucky, but we love Lorcana. This is a video about love and hate. The Lorcana community at large rallied behind Ruby Amethyst against Bucky discard, not just because it was powerful, but also due to its popularity and perceived ease of play. Of course, top players would be able to pilot the deck much better than the average player picking up the deck for the first time, but there were many stories of players switching to Emerald Steel just for set championships and doing very, very well. TCG players picking up the most powerful deck and bringing it to tournaments isn't new. It's a tale as old as time. But what made the community hate this deck so much was how unfair it felt when it played out how the deck was designed to be played. With the generous mulligan that Lorcana provides, again allowing players to return any cards they don't like to their deck and then drawing that same amount back, with no card penalty, it just made the oppressive game plan of the deck far too consistent. And when you don't allow your opponent to play the game, then it was in many cases decided before the first card was even inked. Why do we hate the Boogeyman? We hate him because we first fear him. We grant power to the Boogeyman through our fears. And because the Boogeyman has this power over us, we despise him. Players hated Bucky for the same reason. Players are afraid of losing. It's human nature. We want to win, and seeing the dreaded squirrel on turn 2 causes that fear, contempt, and hate to bubble up to the surface. Players are afraid they won't have fun because of the card's effect, afraid that they'll have to keep a worse hand to deal with Diablo, afraid they'll lose, afraid they worked so hard playtesting for nothing, afraid the game they love won't feel the same anymore when all they see is the Squirrel Squeak Tutor, game after game, match after match, event after event. To survive, we were forced to take the power away from the Boogeyman. We made ourselves forget, and hopefully the Boogeyman and our hatred will truly disappear. I think we may end up looking back at this time in Lorcana's history with blissful nostalgia, not because we liked playing with or against Bucky, but because most of us hated it. This era of competitive Lorcana will be defined by our feelings for the discard deck. Whether it was our animosity towards the archetype, our self-loathing for playing a deck we didn't love, or our joy in simply reveling in the chaos and the power Emerald Steel offered us. It's an experience all of us shared, and in the end, we will look back at Bucky with a smile. We all survived the monster in the closet, and in the end, we celebrated his defeat. I hope you guys enjoyed this first video essay from the Orion TCG channel. I have to say, in the process of writing, and editing this video, I did look to many video essayists that I admire on this platform, many of them within the same space that I operate on my main channel, Key Issues, the superhero space. People like Owen Likes Comics and Loverboy Media, they provided a lot of inspiration during this process, as well as Ristic Studies, who makes videos on Magic the Gathering in a very, very similar vein to this. I adore his videos, and I hope that I was able to make something half as good as they are. If you guys like this video, please let me know down in the comments. I'd love to make some more for you. If you didn't like this video, also let me know why down in the comments so I can get better. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you when we crack the next one.